What's up, guys? I'm BTC. Overwatch 2 is going to add lots of stuff to the game, heroes, maps, game modes, but in addition to that, there's also going to be a lot of changes in terms of hero balancing. Quite a few characters are going to get significant buffs, nerfs, and even reworks. Characters right now that might even be considered to be mostly balanced are still likely going to get at least some small changes when Overwatch 2 gets released. We know that the entire tank role is getting redesigned, and that the roles themselves will now have new passive abilities for every character in that role. On top of that, there seems to be this slight possibility that the number of players per team will be changed from 6 down to 5. Changing the size of the team is just a theory at this point, but even if the team sizes stay at 6, all of the other changes will still require a lot of rebalancing. And finally, there's also the very real possibility that some characters may get moved into different roles, as Blizzard has brought this up in the past. There's no doubt that the Overwatch devs are reviewing every single character in the game, but what sort of changes can we expect? Let's start with the tank role, as those characters will be likely getting the biggest changes. The tank role has always been broken up into several unofficial categories. You have tanks, off-tanks, and bruisers. Tanks primarily focus on defense and protection, bruisers primarily focus on damage, and the off-tanks are somewhere in the middle. However, most team comps almost always required a tank as the anchor point for the team. It wasn't too long ago that running a combination of bruisers and off-tanks, like for example Roadhog and Zarya, was a quick way to get your team absolutely destroyed. And while it might not be the most optimal right now, the situation is more flexible than it ever has been before. However, this situation with the subcategories created a lot of problems. The first was just player understanding, where most players would insist that the team would need to have an anchor tank like Reinhardt or Orisa every single time, no matter what. And if the team didn't have that such of a tank, then it would cause a lot of conflict among the players on that very team. I've seen dozens and dozens of matches where a player on my team would just throw the match and cause us to lose because that player didn't like the combination of tanks that we had and we didn't have a proper anchor tank. So certainly there's a perception issue with the characters in the tank role. The other problem is that certain combinations are just objectively better than anything else. Double barrier is a great example of this. While barriers have been nerfed, that issue still remains and will likely resurface if a new tank is added to the game later on that also has a barrier. So what Blizzard is doing for Overwatch 2 is removing the tank and the off-tank subcategories, leaving only bruisers. Every single character in the tank role is going to be reworked so that they function closer to something that you would expect from Roadhog. Certainly this doesn't mean that the heroes are going to completely lose their defensive abilities. Reinhardt, Orisa, Sigma will likely retain their barriers, but they'll probably be a little bit weaker or possibly less available than they currently are. This can be done by increasing the cooldown or lowering the recharge on the barrier. Whatever it's going to do, it's still going to have the defensive protective abilities. They just probably aren't going to be the focus anymore. Also, consider the possibility of the teams being reduced down to 5 players, as I mentioned before. If that does turn out to be the case, then characters like Zarya and D.Va would be massively underpowered in a solo tank position compared to some of the other heroes. Regardless, this doesn't mean that the characters are going to get entirely new abilities, but rather their existing abilities will be altered to be more effective, and also more focus on damage than on defense. We saw with Reinhardt, his Fire Strike will now hold 2 charges that will each have their own cooldown, similar to Brigida's Repair Pack or Junkrat's remotes. Reinhardt's charge was also changed, so now you have a great deal of control over your movement, as well as the ability to stop the charge anytime you want. These are both effectively the same abilities, it's just that they're much better than the existing versions. And that, I think we can expect more of that for the other characters and similar changes. We're not going to see entire reworks, just more kind of mini reworks and possibly buffs to the cooldowns and the damage and that sort of thing. For example, Winston's Leap might have extra damage or maybe some other effect where it has an upward knockback similar to what Hammond has with his pile driver, or maybe it causes a mini stun, which is only 0.1 or 0.2 seconds, something to just kind of disrupt the enemy team rather than kind of locking them in place. Although keep in mind that Blizzard is trying to reduce the amount of CC in the game, and therefore there probably will be more changes that are not CC involved. Moving on to the DPS role, there are several characters that have been a problem for a very long time. Bastion, Torbjorn, Symmetra, and Sombra are the ones that stick out the most. When Blizzard was originally making the game, the idea was that players would switch the characters quite often. They expected almost every player to switch at least once or twice in a match. Obviously, that's not what happened. However, we still have some characters lingering from this old design philosophy, and these characters are highly specialized, performing niche functions, and in general are significantly worse than the other characters in the game, which is why you always see them at the absolute bottom of the pick rates. Of these characters that I just mentioned, none suffers more than Bastion, who was designed to be a defensive character for a defense role that doesn't even exist anymore. And on top of that, Bastion is consistently the least played character in the entire game by a very, very large margin. The funny thing about all this is the new passive ability that's going to be added to the DPS role is that they're all going to get a movement speed increase. So for characters like McCree or Soldier or Genji or whoever, this movement speed is great, but it makes Bastion even more of a joke character as he spends the vast majority of his time locked in place. Yeah, you need to get up and move to other locations every now and again, but for the most part, Bastion is sitting in one spot in turret form because it is just significantly better, exponentially better than his normal walking around form. So he has a movement speed that he doesn't even get to use almost all the time. And it seems very likely that this character and some of the others that I've mentioned earlier will be getting more significant changes than just a little extra damage here or a little extra health there. There are two other characters in the DPS role that are worth mentioning, and that would be Mei and Doomfist. As I have pointed out previously, Mei is already designed like a tank character. In many ways, she's more of a tank than some of the characters like Hammond and Roadhog. It was briefly mentioned by Blizzard that they're considering moving some of these characters into different roles, and I think that Mei getting moved into the tank role would probably be the highest on that list. Also, Doomfist, he seems to fit into the lines of what they intend the new tank role to be, the bruiser role that they're kind of moving every one of those characters into. He has a larger hitbox than the average character, he has more health, and he certainly feels a lot more like the type of character that should be trying to push around the enemy team instead of sneaking into the backline to take out one of the supports. After all, he has this intimidating presence and also is in possession of the incredibly powerful Doomfist Gauntlet, but instead of going and kind of moving the enemy around like you would expect, he's basically just, sneaks in and takes out like the weakest members of the enemy team, and it just doesn't really feel like something that you would expect from Doomfist. While it is possible that Symmetra could get moved back into the support role, I think it's unlikely. She's still going to need a bunch of changes because Symmetra is still a garbage character, but I think they're more likely going to just try to make her into a better DPS. If they were going to move any of the DPS into support, it would probably end up being Sombra, as she is kind of effectively a utility support character right now, though if they did end up moving her into the actual support role, they would probably need a whole bunch of extra changes to the character as well. But moving on to the support role, those characters are not going to be changed as much as the tanks, but probably more than the DPS, and the reason for this is that all of the support characters are now going to have an automatic heal that functions just like what Mercy has. Right away, we can assume that Mercy's probably going to get a new passive ability for herself, and probably some other changes to go along with it, but then consider the other support characters. If Baptiste and Ana can heal automatically, that is going to drastically change the power level of those characters. Both of them right now typically are quite far in the back line, and they don't really take damage on a consistent basis. Usually, it means that they get one hit by a Widow or a Hanzo, or someone like a Doomfist or a Genji has to go into the back line to deal with them. But chip damage against those characters don't really do a whole lot, and if they had automatic healing, then that chip damage would become absolutely worthless, because, sure, they take a couple hits, and then they just kind of hide for a second, and then they heal back to full. right now, they have to deal with their own self-healing, which is the Bionade or the Regenerative Burst, and those have longer cooldowns. But if they can just automatically heal, then they're going to be way, way more powerful than they currently are. And also consider that the self-heal will overlap with several existing support hero functions. Zenyatta already heals with the shield, Baptiste has the Regenerative Burst, and Brigitte's Inspire passive is her self-heal ability. It's unlikely that these will stay the same, as they probably would overlap with that auto self-heal passive ability way too much. You would basically have Zenyatta who's healing at twice the speed, same thing with Mercy if she ended up keeping it, and then the other thing is like Baptiste, the Regenerative Burst wouldn't really be all that necessary anymore. So it's likely that the effects of these abilities and these functions will be changed based on the character, but they're probably going to lose some of the effectiveness for Baptiste and Brigitte, but they'll gain effectiveness and they'll be buffed and increased for the effect on the teammates. So if, for whatever reason, Baptiste keeps the Regenerative Burst, they're probably going to switch it around, where it's not going to heal himself as much anymore, and it's going to end up healing your teammates more. And then the same thing with Brigitte. Her Inspire is probably going to stop healing her as much as it does now, and instead it will increase the healing for everybody else. Now, as for any characters that might be moved out of the support role, I think that that is incredibly unlikely since there's such a small number of support characters as it is. And there is one other thing to consider, which is more of a mystery than all of the other stuff. That is that when Overwatch 2 gets released, we're going to get probably at least 3 characters, maybe even more than that. And these characters are going to have all different kinds of new abilities that we've never seen before, and some of them might have weird interactions with existing characters. And Blizzard might decide that they want to keep the new abilities, and instead they just go and make some changes to the older ones, so that way whatever weird stuff and all the incredibly powerful synergies and stuff might not be possible anymore because they make those changes. And of course this is all guesswork because other than Sojourn, we really have no idea what any of these new abilities are going to be. But I'm just saying that keep in mind that new characters might have a bigger effect and some of their abilities might kind of change the game more than what you would normally expect. Kind of like what happened with Baptiste in the Immortality field, where it really changed everything when that character got added. Overall, I think it's pretty safe to say that most of the characters in the game are going to play similar to how they are now, but certainly new strategies are going to be developed and will be possible, and there'll be new play styles for the character. Even though it's the same character that we've been kind of playing before, because the game has changed and because the characters have been rebalanced, then playing how you are right now might not be the most effective anymore, and you might have to have new strategies. But now let me ask you guys, which characters do you think are most likely to get a rework, or most likely to get moved into a different role? Let me know down below. A big thanks to all the Paragons and other channel members for all your support. If you'd like to become one and grab some cool rewards, click the join button down below. Also, if you enjoyed the video, drop a like before you leave. And remember, always blame the controller because it's never your fault.